Hello, my name is István Koncz. I'm an assistant research fellow at the Institute of Archaeological Sciences at the Eötvös Loránd University. I'm an archaeologist. My main research field is the 5th, 7th centuries of the Carpathian Basin. This is the migration period. And I have big interest in biosocial archaeology, in particular in combining ancient DNA analysis, isotopes, and archaeological data and integrating them into a big historical narrative. In today's presentation, I would like to talk about the migration of the Langobards. Langobards were a Germanic tribe, Germanic group that migrated from North Germany till Italy. Their first appearance in the written sources happened in the 2nd century, but then they disappeared altogether and reappeared like at the end of the 5th century, but mostly in written sources dated to the 8th century. And at that time, they're already in the Middle Danube region, basically modern-day Czechia, Slovakia, and Lower Austria. And then in the beginning of the 6th century, they occupied the former territory of the territory of the former Pannonian provinces, today's Transdanubia, Western Hungary. And in the presentation, I would like to focus their migration from Pannonia, so today's Hungary, to Italy, where they established a long-standing kingdom that lasted till the 8th century. There are two main historical models today to describe their migration from Pannonia to Italy. The first one, developed by Walter Pohl, describes it as a single large wave led by the king. And the second one is by Michael Borgolte, that understands this movement as a series of waves over decades, so a much less centralized movement that lasted for like an extended period of time. But is there an archaeological evidence for this migration, and what is that archaeology can actually offer to understand this historical narrative? How is archaeological evidence structured around migrations, and what are the possibilities of studying migration in archaeology? In this particular example, in the second half of the 6th century, we have Pannonia and we have Italy, these two regions separated by the Alps as like a transit zone that's modern-day in Slovenia. In Pannonia, what's happening that around this date described in the written sources, 568, we have a series of communities that were abandoned around that time. This doesn't mean that they were around exactly at 568. Some of these sites were continuously used, let's say, the end of the 6th century, but it is true that we don't really have continuity between the 6th and the 7th centuries in this region. We have a particular set of archaeological objects that we identify as grave goods in these sites, such as small brooches like S brooches and disc brooches, larger brooches, mostly bow brooches in this case, weaponry, swords, double-edged swords, spatas, shields, spears, etc. So this is like, in a way, very typical 6th century material in most of Western Europe, but this is what we have in the middle of the 6th century in Pannonia. Around the same time, there are a series of communities that are appearing in Italy, and they show very clear similarities to the Pannonian material. We have the same exact types of brooches, S brooches and bow brooches. We have similar weaponry, but we also have similarities in everyday tools like single-sided combs, spindle whores, etc. So there is a clear direct connection in the material culture between the two regions. And it's not just the artifact types, it's also the ornaments, the decoration, the first animal style that appears in Pannonia and also appears around the same time in Italy. So there are these like direct connections between the two regions. Similar artifact types, similar ornaments, similar female dress, similarities in burial customs, etc. The interpretation of these kind of information is that these are phenomena that are present in almost all Western Europe, so there are multiple interpretations to understand them. So how can like one object move to another region or one phenomena appear in a different region? There are multiple ways how these could be transferred from one region to another. It can be transfer of goods, basically trade, could be transfer of ideas like religion, fashion, etc. Could be transfer of technology, like workshop practices, for example. But of course, it can be the transfer of persons, meaning mobility. One people coming from a different region and maybe settling in another one. Because of the disappearance of these communities in Pannonia and around the same time the appearance of new communities in Italy with a very similar material culture, I think it's safe to say that this is a migration between these two regions. In a way, in the last few decades, archaeology actually moved away from migration as like an interpretative framework and focused more on like local development of communities. But Langobard migration, because of the extensive written sources and the very solid archaeological background that we have, is one of the few migrations of the period that was actually never questioned in the research. So now that we have said that there is actual evidence of migration in archaeology, what can we say about the temporality? First of all, we can say that even though the description of this migration is that everyone left Pannonia in 568, basically Alboin the king packed up all his people, all the wives, all the children, burned down their settlements and took all their goods to Italy. This is not really what we see in archaeology. What we see is that there is a gradual disappearance of communities up until the end of the 6th century. In that way, like a more elongated historical model, multiple waves of migration over decades actually fits the archaeological record better. This, however, doesn't mean that we exclude the possibility, or it should exclude the possibility of like a large single wave led by the king. Who were migrating? That's one of the main questions. In the written sources, it is pretty evident that basically everyone. In general, in terms of like migrations, in the migration period or the early Middle Ages, there are like two main ideas. Let's say elite migration, when an elite group of warriors is actually moving and settling somewhere and creating like a new kingdom. And the other one is like the migration of whole people with basically everyone. And like this is like basically the two ways that's depicted in art, depicted in TV series, depicted in books, etc. Based on the written sources, the migration of the Langobards would mean the migration of whole people. But this is actually very interesting because migration in a way is an adventure. It's not for everyone, basically. It's always like moving even like from one city to another is something that makes most people uncomfortable. It really depends how used you are to like moving around, leaving everything behind. Basically, migration is always like a two-way connection, because if multiple people are moving, migration won't be successful for everyone. Some people will say that, oh yeah, this new place is not really for me. And this is exactly what archaeology can trace in a way. Even if we speak about, like, let's say, everyone is moving, we can test how important is mobility in the everyday life of a community is. We have isotopic data for the 6th century cemetery of Solad. This is a small site located at the southern shore of the lake Balaton. And we did strontium analysis. And it showed that none of the adults were actually born at the same place where they were buried. This means that at least once in their lifetime they relocated. This really shows that in case of these 6th century communities, especially in Solad, mobility and relocation was an integral part of their life. And this is exactly what we see in the 6th century. So we can see that at least the Solad community had an idea how like relocation works, and they were in a way open for it. The second question would be, so how did they migrate and which route did they actually take? Based on the written sources, we have two possibilities from Pannonia to Italy, one through the Alps, and one is sailing through the Adriatic. And both of them are actually plausible. The Langobards were actually fighting in wars in Italy already before 568. They were mercenaries in the army of Narses, the Byzantine general who was fighting the Ostrogoths in the middle of the 6th century. And we have written sources that they were actually shipped through the Adriatic. But this, of course, was only possible because they had the possibility to use the Eastern Roman fleet for that. During the migration in 568, the written sources are actually very clear that they are crossing the Alps, they are crossing the mountains in the modern-day Slovenia. So can we support this with archaeological evidence? In a way we can. This is a basic network analysis that I did based on brooches. Every connection is a connection based on the presence of the same brooch type, and every connection is weighted against the number of these connections. And it shows that Kranj, located in middle Slovenia today, is actually the center of this whole Bruch network of like this Pannonia. So even though the site is actually on the edge of the region, it has a central role. It's one of the largest cemeteries of this period. But it also shows that it almost looks like that as everyone was passing through this region, someone basically died there from every community and they were buried there. Kranj is actually located next to the late Roman road, and that was the infrastructure that they probably used during the migration from Pannonia to Italy. And of course, there is this big question, why did they migrate? Archaeology uses a lot of models and theories from sociology, especially Everett Lee's theory of migration plays an important role. Basically, he described migration as you have to have push and pull factors that basically motivate you to move away from a region and arrive to another one, but these have to be strong enough to like overcome the obstacles that's like between the two regions or the two locations. These obstacles, of course, are the Alps and the distance between Pannonia and Italy. So what could be considered as like push factors in case of the migration of the Langobards? So first of all, 6th century is the century of natural catastrophes. It's an awful time to live in. You have very long, 5 years long winters. You have, because of that, famines, you have droughts, you have earthquakes. You also have solar eclipses. We have written sources that at a battle between the Langobards and the Gepids, the two armies were already on the field and they were ready to fight when the solar eclipse happened, and it frightened both armies so much that they actually like just left without doing the fighting, for example. And of course, the 6th century, it's the time of the plague of Justinian, like the first plague pandemic. Based on written evidence, the Langobards met with the plague only in Italy, but now we already have genetic evidence from 6th century sites that the plague was already killing people here in Pannonia. So there is an abundance of natural catastrophes. And if that wasn't enough, there could be also political reasons behind it. First of all, the arrival of the Avars, nomadic steppe warriors with like a fast expanding empire. And of course, they were like more aggressive and probably more dangerous than the former neighbors of the Langobards, the Gepids. Of course, they could be understood as one of the factors. They are usually considered as the main factors behind the migration. And of course, we have to keep in mind that this region, Western Hungary, Trans-Nubian region, it was actually a frontier zone for very long for the Roman Empire, between the Roman Empire and the barbarian world. And after like the secession of Eastern and Western Roman Empire, it actually became a border zone between the two halves of the empire. So this is not really a safe zone at this point. And what can be considered as pull factors? So why is Italy so nice? First of all, you have the Roman infrastructure, you have standing cities, you have wells. And there is also a political power vacuum here in Italy at this time. So the Byzantine army has been fighting the Ostrogoths for a long time. Of course, they are winning, but they are also very low in numbers. And the Langobards actually know that, and information is key in every migration, like even today, that they know how to get there and what to expect there. They know that there isn't like any kind of army that can resist to a conquest like really well at this period. So the safety of Italy, the plunder, the cities, they could be all considered as important pull factors in this case. So, and what are the consequences of a migration like that? So the consequences of a migration is usually a lot more complex than like just simple relocation. These have like very important like social consequences, for example. Like I've already said that there are these like very strong direct connections between the two regions, like already around the middle of the 6th century, around the date of 568, but these connections became even stronger in the late 6th century. This is probably because migration is always like a two-way highway. There are, of course, a lot of people going to Italy, but probably quite a few people are coming back because they couldn't find like what they were looking for in Italy. We see that some of the sites actually survive up until the end of the 6th century, they are very well dated with these like late object types, such as those belt mounds that I show on the image, for example. And there are also very strong cultural connections, even stronger cultural connections to the Mediterranean appearing at the second half of the 6th century in Pannonia. This is probably an influx of goods to Pannonia from Italy through these like very intensive contacts. And in a way, like a migration is usually signaled as like a single large arrow on most of the maps. You can find multiple maps on the internet like that. But if we zoom in, what we see is a series of arrows, most of them probably pointing towards Italy, but quite a few of them would point towards Pannonia with like extensive contacts. And the main like social difference is, or like the social impact of migration is that the Langobard society already has this like internal hierarchy before the migration, but this is something that we see that even more emphasized after the migration. The role of the warriors, the role of the warrior elite is actually much more important during and after the migration, and we see a much larger deepening economical difference between the different strata of the society. For example, this is a time when precious metals, silver and gold, are actually starting to appear in the graves of males as well. Before that, they were only present in female burials. And basically, this is where we stand right now. The next steps will be, we are working on most of these sites, or quite a few of these sites, involved in this whole migration process with archaeogenetic analysis and isotopic analysis. So we hope that in the long run, we will be able to identify direct connections between sites and like really understand the impact of these migrations on a population level, on a community level in Italy and also in Pannonia. Thank you very much for the attention.